Good space time, y'all. In this episode of the Citizen Cosmos podcast, we had the pleasure of speaking with Chris Goes from Anoma, a project dedicated to providing privacy and governance on the blockchain. During our conversation, we delved into some thought-provoking topics such as the importance of privacy and governance, the polycentric conception of law, and the cultural context in which money operates. We explored how semantics can lead to dystopia and the dangers of gradient descent. We tackled the nature of money and what people truly want or don't want out of it. Furthermore, we discussed the solutions to the shortcoming of blockchain governance, democracy, social equilibrium using technology, and the consensus building process.
Maybe it's like a perfectly coordinated dystopia. There's a lot of what I would call like gradient descent, and DeFi can sometimes slip into this. And if we want to build, products that people, in 100 years are still going to remember, as opposed to being consigned to the annals of some Wikipedia page editing debate, we need a theory of what people want financial systems to do when light speed delays become real, like in a multiplanetary species, and how that changes the dynamics of cultural evolution. Pay American taxes, and I am forced to pay that under penalty of guns.
Hi everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Citizen Cosmos podcast. Today I have with me Christopher Goes. I will introduce him as the founder of the Anoma project, but Chris, hi and welcome to the show, first of all.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. And second, I will ask you to introduce yourself in however way you would like that people to know you. I mean, I said founder of Anoma, but I know you're a lot more than that, and there's a lot more. But it's up to you, of course. So please introduce yourself. Tell us everything you do these days. What are your interests? What do you work on? And whatever else you want us to know.
Boy, I don't know if I'm all that interesting, but I'll try. I got involved in the Cosmos project, which was kind of my first introduction to this space from a serious perspective back 4.5 years ago now, about a year before the launch of the Cosmos Hub. I initially joined because the idea of IBC sounded very appealing to me. I hadn't done sophisticated research at that point in time into what all of the technical constraints or economic constraints of blockchain protocols were. I just liked the idea of kind of allowing for free interoperation. At that time, I was interested in sort of what you might call polycentric conceptions of law. So where different communities have some rules on which they agree internally, and internally they accord to those rules and they agree on some, but not all rules with other communities. And so you need a very flexible system to capture what you agree on, what you don't agree on, allow for interaction where you agree, and sort of separation or sovereignty or freedom of different choices wherever you don't. And IBC certainly doesn't solve that problem completely, but it seemed to me at the time like a step in that direction. Protocol design perspective, which was also a technical area that I was at least somewhat familiar with. So I joined, at that point in time, it was All in Bits Incorporated, or Tendermint, the company, and moved to Berlin, Germany, to work for Tendermint. I worked for Tendermint for 2 years-ish. I first worked on the launch of the Cosmos Hub, then on IBC, and when the engineering team spun out of Tendermint to form Interchain GmbH, I was part of that effort. I stayed with Interchain GmbH until the launch of IBC, and then left with Al and Adrian, who were also co-founders, found Anoma together. We had also been running a Cosmos validator cryptogame labs prior to that. That's sort of the Cosmos-centric introduction. Yeah, I would say that, I've definitely started from a very technical perspective. I was at first a software engineer, then kind of a protocol designer, and to try to broaden my understanding in areas which I'm really personally very unfamiliar with, at least from an academic perspective, like anthropology and economics and sort of cultural systems, since those seem to play such a large role in how these kind of equilibria of technology and human interaction end up working out.
There's two facts I love about your introduction. One is how you are completely denying your own importance. I love that because I know the work you did for IBC and I know what kind of things you've written. I love this. It's great. And second, it's fascinating to me that everything you say, you mention communication, because in my opinion, blockchain is a communication tool, right? We are social creatures. We cannot survive without communication. So I'm excited that a developer on your level, somebody who's contributed so much to IBC, is talking about polycentric concepts and consensuses, and that's what got them interested essentially in that technology. Why, first thing is first, you mentioned that IBC doesn't solve those issues. And yeah, I have my own opinion why it doesn't, but I would like to hear yours. Why doesn't IBC solve the issues you were mentioning about polycentric concepts and communication and consensus?
Right. No, I mean, I think maybe IBC is a necessary but not sufficient component of a solution, as in it's part of the technical substrate you need for consensus systems to interoperate. But that's not the technical substrate is very insufficient to determine a social equilibrium, right? So if you think of like what social equilibrium, some proper theorists are going to kill me for this, right? But if you think of what the social equilibrium of a system is, it's some combination of the technology. So like what the system does, you could think of it as a syntactical level. So like language has syntax and semantics. The syntax determines what's grammatical, it determines what are like words, it determines how you tell one word from another. But syntax alone doesn't have anything to do with the relationship between the language and the word. So in our language, banana means, yellow thing that you put in smoothies, at least I do, and apple means, a red round thing that you chop down. At least I do. And we could have another language where apple means long yellow thing and banana means round red thing, right? And that would be a difference in semantics, right? The association between the word, or the correspondence between the words and the reality has changed, but kind of the same syntax. So similarly, protocols are basically syntax, like TCP/IP, most blockchain protocols describe how, like, what are valid states of the system and how you can transition between those states. And they can have informational syntax, or like private keys, or, you can authorize users by whether or not they know particular information, which is a very powerful protocol design primitive, but it isn't sufficient to determine semantics, like how a system is used. So in another analogy, you can have a monetary system, and what happens as a result of the monetary system is in part a function of like the technical design, like what is money? How does it flow between people? Is it privately owned, collectively owned? What are the mechanisms of issue and stuff like this? But the other part depends on what people do with the money. Like when you have money, most of the time you're doing something with it, you're spending it, you're giving it to somebody else. You could have a monetary system that had like some currency with some currency issuance policy, and everyone used it to buy sandwiches. You could have the same currency issuance policy, everyone uses it to buy weapons. Those are two very different social equilibria, right? The system alone is not sufficient to determine social equilibria. So IBC is the technical part, or the syntactical part, right? But it's not, number one, it doesn't go all the way in the protocol design perspective. It doesn't include stuff like, say, tokens, or the specific units of the system, which you want potentially to correspond to features of the real world. And number two, it doesn't include the kind of cultural or sort of use praxis part of equilibria.
You mentioned semantics, another topic that I'm absolutely, well, not even fascinated, but I'm obsessed with semantics, to be honest with you. How do you unify semantics, in your opinion? I mean, you spoke about a great example of bananas and apples. And I mean, one of the most common examples, is the Bulgarians yes or no, right? I don't know whether you're familiar, right? Is complete, exactly. So just for the listeners who are not seeing us, the Bulgarian yes and no are different movements of the head to what we're used to. So exactly what Chris was saying. So how do we unify semantics? How do we get to the point of that everything that we say means everything for everybody, the same thing for everybody?
Right. To be honest, I'm not sure that it's possible. I'm also not even sure that it's desirable. I mean, in some sense, if you think of a completely unified semantics where everyone wants the same thing, it's, to me, it's a little bit dystopian. Maybe it's like a perfectly coordinated dystopia. So for the inhabitants, maybe it's a utopia insofar as it's perfectly coordinated with what they want. But it sounds like really boring, I guess.
I agree.
My objection is not so theoretical. It just sounds boring. What would there be to do in such a world? Everything would already be done. So I think one of the ideas behind, for example, polycentric law is that you have to accept that semantics is not going to be unified, or at least that what people will want to do, maybe preferences, semantics are like the correspondence, but preferences are not going to be unified, and work under that assumption. But still, then you face the kind of opposite question of how do you coordinate it all? And then you're kind of answering the slightly derivative question of how do we figure out if we agree on semantics and what we want, and if we have figured that out, how do we actually coordinate what's there? And if you have a faithful mechanism and have agreed on these things, then it seems like you should be able to get to maybe a mutually preferred.
I totally agree. I think, it seems that whenever we talk about, semantics or syntax, we're talking about consensus underneath it all. So going back to consensus, and considering you did so much work on IBC, and you already mentioned what are, in your opinion, some of the issues with IBC, but how do we improve upon that? And I mean, not necessarily technically, maybe, again, feel free to answer the question and however you hear in it, but how do we improve upon it?
Right. I mean, I think there are two interesting versions of this question. One of them is technical. Another one is maybe more product-oriented or sort of cultural, technological. To just as a brief shout out to the technical answer to the question, after working on IBC for a few years, I've come to the conclusion that IBC and Tendermint should be unified because it cleans up a bunch of the abstractions, and it allows... IBC does a whole host of things like handshakes, which are extremely complicated and hard to get right, and props to the brilliant engineers at Interchain and Informal for getting it right, despite it being complicated. But I think some of it's unnecessary if you unify IBC entendrement into more content-addressed naming, which basically gets rid of handshakes. So I think that there are technical improvements that can be made which would achieve the same functionality for applications which use IBC while simplifying the protocol stack a lot. Soares Chen from Informal has a really good proposal that I keep trying to promote. Someone will do it. On this, you can ask him. To the second question, and that said, even doing that, it kind of cleans up some of the technical stack, but it doesn't, and it adds some new features, but it doesn't change so much what IBC offers to applications. IBC already is quite general as an asynchronous cross-chain message passing protocol. So I think we can answer question 1 and 2 independently. To the second question, I'm not sure that it's precisely IBC that needs to change, but what I would like to see, from the Cosmos ecosystem and other blockchain ecosystems is a much more thought out theory of product. And what I mean by a theory of product is, to think about, there's a lot of what I would call like gradient descent, and DeFi can sometimes slip into this, and what I mean by gradient descent is where product designers or people who are actually building things on top of blockchains seem to be asking themselves the question of something like, what do people want now? Or can I take this existing thing and make it better in this specific way, and maybe people will want that. And I don't mean that kind of innovation is fantastic. My concern is that is 99% of what's happening. And the danger of gradient descent is that it's gradient descent, that it tends to fall into local minima, and that you tend to end up with something that maybe a small segment of people in the world who have tokens and want to trade their existing tokens wants, or not even that, just some specific gaming thing or something like this. But that you don't, when you're just looking at these very present time indicators, you don't necessarily get a sense of what a much broader swath of people would want, or what people would want in the long term, absent some very specific conditions that are likely to change. So I think, in terms of what I mean by a theory of product, I want to give shout outs to some groups who really are doing this. I would say the Circles project in Berlin, the Grassroots Economics project, some of these folks have thought about, what is money? How is money embedded in cultural contexts? What do people want or not want out of money? And how do maybe blockchain systems as a design tool change some of these equilibria or enable things that weren't before possible? And I think more experimentation in that direction, but also trying to come up with a more serious mathematical language for describing what it is that we want financial systems to do would be really helpful. So by contrast, sometimes it seems to be like there's this really strong two cultures divide, where there are brilliant engineers and mathematicians, distributed system scientists, cryptographers that come up with very well specified definitions of the syntax of the protocols, how they work, how they're safe from a distributed systems perspective, how they're privacy preserving from a cryptographic perspective, etc. But then there's this line, and on top of these protocols, they're smart contracts, they're apps, and they don't have often they have no theory whatsoever, right? They have there's a token and it does something, and first we'll make a token because that's how we fundraise, and then we'll try and come up with a theory to make the token valuable. And I mean, in part, this is I don't mean to critique people too much, because in part, this is just because our current economic system is so broken that a lot of people have kind of given up and don't even try to come up with theories anymore. And I could totally empathize, but on the other hand, it's still not going to work. And if we want to build, products that people, in 100 years are still going to remember, as opposed to being consigned to the annals of some Wikipedia page editing debate, we need a theory of what people want financial systems to do and whether or not we are accomplishing that.
I'm gonna, play devil's advocate now, but if you just said, unified semantics, of course that doesn't mean unified agreement and unified consensus is boring, right? But isn't unified consensus on what all those economical theories would achieve would also be boring? Because if everybody was believing all we need is just, I don't know, whatever, to build the next Eiffel Tower with the reward that we get in. So wouldn't it be kind of boring as well?
Right, that is a good question. To be clear, I'm not advocating for one economic theory to rule them all. I'm just advocating for more theory, because that seems like that's the direction in which things need to go. But still, I think there is somewhat of a distinction here in that, so when we talk about, for example, a system of money, we could agree on the mechanisms of a system of money, and we could agree on a theory of correspondence, like how we want to use that money to represent things in the real world, without agreeing on what we want in the real world. And when I'm talking about, maybe I'm talking here about unanimity of preferences or something like that. I think it would be boring if everyone wanted the same thing. But there's some things on which consensus is kind of like free and doesn't seem to cost anyone very much. Like, for example, TCP/IP is a good example of this. More or less, everyone benefits by adopting the same standardized set of internet protocols. TCP/IP is maybe not like perfectly efficient, but it's 90% efficient for what it does. And it does, the only thing you could replace it with is something like 10% better for the specific thing which it does in organizing messages between computers, right? So I think there's similar, not necessarily all the way to kind of the end product or interface, but there may be some similar points in between IBC and like user spending money that we can come to consensus on.
It's interesting. I mean, I know I'm kind of like dragging you another way a little bit, but I'm just, I want to get into your head a little bit more. Sorry about that. And to me, it seems that, I mean, you're mentioning like clear set examples like TCP/IP, which are easy to understand for people like myself, you, and a lot of the listeners probably of this podcast, and probably a lot of other people as well. But this is something that I was trying to ask people a few months ago in Lisbon. I was going around and talking with Stakefish and with it was Staking and Chorus One and a lot of the guys from that. And the set of questions I had for them was always like, do you guys honestly believe that what we are doing here is the problems people are trying to solve? And what I mean is, you mentioned semantics, you mentioned things like unification, but there is one thing like tradition, for example, which really is a pain in the ass because, for a lot of people that believe in whatever is religious tradition or any other taboo topic, which could concern economical things as well, like Shariat law, for example, right? Or the 10th in Judaism or whatever, is really creating a problem for us to have consensus and to move on forward as humanity, I think. So again, we're kind of coming back to consensus, right? It seems that it's always fucking issue, consensus.
Yeah, I mean, I think this will quickly veer beyond the domain of blockchain, but there's an interesting question here as to, where do my freedoms infringe on yours, right? If I'm observing different religious practices in the privacy of a home or in some private way, it seems like that doesn't. If I'm attacking you with the rifle, it seems like it does, right? So there are differences here. I won't try to draw an exact line, right? But there's some spectrum. To me, the question, though, I don't think that's a problem that blockchains can solve, as in, at least not directly, because the most blockchains can do is help change the economic system so that there will be less reason for, maybe less possibility for military industrial complexes to capture government money printing facilities and manufacture absurd amounts of unnecessary armaments. But if there are blockchains don't stop guys with guns, and they don't change that fundamental question of when some freedoms infringe on others in the use of force. I think, we should admit that or try to see clearly. That said, to me, that's not the important question because it's not, number one, it's not particularly tractable. It's just like fundamental. And number two, or rather it has to do with different questions in physics, like the cost of attack versus defense. I think then there's an interesting question when light speed delays become real, like in a multiplanetary species, and how that changes the dynamics of cultural evolution. But maybe I just won't go that far tangentially for now.
No, it's good because I just want to say thank you for what you're saying. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but because I think it's very important to say that blockchain doesn't solve this because a lot of people have this belief that it does, and you're right, guns don't kill people, people kill people, it's, very old song from, I guess, mine and your childhood roughly. But, so go on as far as you can, as you want, because I think you're right by saying this. I absolutely agree with you on that.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the question is, for example, I am an American citizen, I pay American taxes, and I am forced to pay that under penalty of guns, or indirect guns. And I am pretty unhappy with some of the things the American government spends its money on. And some of the things are nice, like social programs. Some of the things are maybe marginal. Does the education system work? I don't know. It's kind of like prison for kids, but at least there's some positive benefits. Some of the things are terrible, like drones hitting civilians in the Middle East and, guns to lock up whistleblowers in jail or threaten them and prevent them from entering the country. And I'm like, in any other situation, I would never pay money to an entity which did this, right? Like, what's coming in there is the force, and that I want to be able to see my family in the United States again, right? But that's a pretty, to me, it feels like a pretty terrible decision to have to make, to be honest. So, independent of, I'm not making a case against taxes specifically, but more generally, I think it's important to ask the question of, is the financial system doing what we want it to do, like as humans, as people? Both at a sort of very micro scale, like for local communities, and at a broad scale for global communities. The financial system is not, sometimes I think, especially in here, I'm going to be maybe slightly spicy, but especially in disciplines such as economics, people take aspects of the financial system as law or like physical law. They're not physical law. The financial system was created by people. It was usually, what we currently have is an amalgamation of many different choices made at many different times and many kind of systemic evolutions that were not, even chosen by any one person or group, but that just were the accumulation of multiple actions. A lot of it's contingent, and, it's difficult to apprehend. It's very complicated. You can't understand every interaction. But on the other hand, to me, the operative question, especially for people interested in signing blockchain protocols, is what do we want the financial system to do? Does our current financial system do it? And if so, or if not, how could we craft an alternative system which did it better, and how much better? How does that system work?
Man, seriously, this is, I think, one of the first times I'm agreeing with the guest in 3.5 years on a 10 out of 10 scale. Just one thing to say, I don't know if you knew, but the irony is that one of the guys who contributed, you said financial laws are not laws, absolutely, but the irony is that John Law, the guy with the surname Law, was one of the biggest contributors to the modern, what people call, you said taxes, I call it theft, the very similar, it's irony, the government, how does the government work? It asks you for money and gives you protection. I know one other entity that works exactly in the same way. It's called the mafia. So if you don't pay, it doesn't protect you, it kills you. So, man. Okay, but let's go back to money for a second. Let's go back to money. So, because it seems that everything we're talking about that can be done, it can be influenced, because consensus, it seems that a bit more difficult to influence, but at least we can influence with blockchain's money. Okay, so let's talk about that. So how do you guys, first of all, and this is going to be more of a project question, but we'll go into detail about that. And I want to know, I don't know if you want to talk about Anoma now or a little bit towards in a couple of minutes, but still, I would like to know maybe how you guys approach economics. I hate the word tokenomics, so I'm not going to use it, sorry. But how do you approach economics in Anoma? But with it, I'm going to ask maybe what are, in your opinion, some of the obvious things, issues that blockchain economics have from what you've seen already, and maybe mention how you guys approach and solve them in Anoma.
Right. So I think there are two categories of blockchain economics questions. The first category is kind of internal system designs. This is most commonly what goes under tokenomics, but even stuff like proof of stake system designs, I would put in this category. So things which have to do, and what I mean by internal system designs is that proof of stake is supposed to serve a pretty clear function in the context of a proof of stake and BOT consensus blockchain. Namely, it's supposed to assign staked validators so that they can be given voting weight in BOT systems. It's supposed to somehow discourage validators from behaving differently than the protocol says that they should behave. And in particular, it's supposed to minimize or try and disincentivize the particular BFT threshold risks at 1/3 and 2/3, right? Those hold true kind of independently of what the blockchain itself does, what the product is. They're just more internal systems design questions. You have a question then of, if you have transactions which are more valuable to reorder than the proof of stake system itself is, that maybe you have some security problems, but you can kind of separate these things by an abstraction barrier. The second question, which, maybe is a bit relevant to my earlier point, but is a question of how do you want the state of this, what I call maybe a theory of correspondence. So what state are you interested in the real world or in some other system in representing on the blockchain? This doesn't have to be the real, quote unquote, real world. It could also be game, right? A theory of what there are items in the game and there are things people can do with them and we want to represent them in this way, right? But even there you have interesting questions I think it was some Second Life clone ended up implementing land taxes, something like that, like Georgian land taxes, because they found out it led to more people staying in the game because the wealth didn't concentrate so much. So they're interesting questions, even for stuff like games. So how do we approach them? We approach them by first bucketing them into kind of those two categories so we can deal with them separately. Nomada, I would say, does not greatly innovate on the second front, as in the product is very simple. The product is just shielded transfers. Nomada innovates a little bit on the first front. We've designed a system called cubic proof of stake, which is a sort of spiritual descendant of the Cosmos spotted proof of stake system that features similar style of bonds, but it has something called cubic slashing, where slash rates change according to what stake of validators committed in a fraction within a particular interval. And the formula ends up being cubic, hence the name. And that's designed to discourage validator centralization, so that if you delegate to several smaller validators who have uncorrelated setups, even if they get slashed, the slash amount will be much less than if one large validator gets punished. And the idea is that that captures some of the risk to the protocol of having many or a small number of large high-power validators. There's maybe some interesting work there that we're hoping might be. The system is quite general. It could be adopted by the Cosmos SDK or by other Cosmos chains. And we're hoping to see, some. Unfortunately, proof of stake system design kind of died 2 years ago. It was a big thing. Around the time of the launch of the Cosmos Hub, everyone was trying new proof of stake systems, and then everyone just concluded that they were good enough and stopped designing new protocols. I'm not convinced the timeline we care about is longer. And also, maybe this is a public service advisory, but if you are running a Cosmos blockchain and using the Cosmos proof of stake system, you should read the code. Not that I think the SDK maintainers do a great job, but this system design was designed for the Cosmos Hub launch by like 3 junior engineers. It's not the perfect proof of stake system. You could probably do better. So some innovation there would be great to see. In the second front, or to the second question, Anoma is, I would say, has been trying to articulate a better theory of correspondence or a theory of product. This is the part that we didn't know how to do. We knew kind of the technical stuff. If you read the original Anoma vision paper, which we don't delete because, censorship resistant, no deleting history, but you will find that it contains a lot of wildly speculative language, which I would now disavow, but it was, it conveyed the direction of investigation that we were interested in. And we have since made a fair amount of progress. You can look at some of the new specs. Still not done yet. I mean, I think we've had to, personally, I've ended up reading a lot of anthropology. We've had to dive into a lot of different disciplines to try and better understand, what we should think of as a theory of product. We've learned a lot from some of the folks at Circles, from Informal's collaborative finance team, from lots of other people in the ecosystem who have different specific perspectives. And we're interested maybe in the more theoretical side, because we're trying to build technology that will work for all of these maybe different community currency schemes and stuff like this. So we're trying to work on that part of the problem.
I just remembered when you were talking about anthropology that I once written an article, part of which was how to fix anthropology with digital consensuses. But yeah, I just remembered it. But regardless of that, can we, I think I skipped one part of Anoma. Can we kind of go back a little bit? And 1 second, let me see if I wrote it down here, because I like doing this. I know that it might not be like, the best thing to do, but I like doing this. I'm going to say a sentence from a website that I think every person who would open the Anoma website will see this sentence. I think it's on your Twitter as well. I mean, the Anoma Twitter. And I want you to help me, really pretend I'm really not understanding any word at all. So Anoma, an intent-centric privacy-preserving protocol for decentralized counterparty discovery, solving, and multi-chain atomic settlement. Now, let's pretend nothing, zero. I want you to choose, if you can, of course, different words to tell me what this sentence says. So, and I don't want grandmas to understand it. I'm really not this kind of person. Let's do adoption for grandmas. No, let's not do adoption for grandmas, because that's going to happen when we're going to be grandmas. So let's just try and explain this in a bit of if you can, really elify that sentence.
Right. Let me try. One, I should say that we're definitely going to change that tagline. We know that it's terrible. It takes time, but we'll find something. It's still accurate, but maybe it doesn't.
It's good.
Taglines are the hardest thing. It's like the bike shedding of protocol design. But I guess what I would say is this. So to us, blockchains are interesting. We like talking about them. We like reasoning about the protocol design. We have I like having long debates about how to do something or another. We're interested in the internals, how the systems work. Perhaps slightly sad, but also probably good discovery of mine that to most people, blockchains are boring. They care about what the system looks from the outside. They want to do something, right? And I see this too, and I've ended up learning more about how the financial system works. And boy, like I really kind of don't want to. Like I don't care how the Fed works. What are these theories? Like it's not very elegant. It's not, it's not aesthetically appealing, right? But I've learned that because I kind of want to understand what's going on. But part of Anoma's thesis is that we want to build a system with very clear abstraction boundaries so that users can use the system based on what they want to do with it. And it's the system's responsibility to figure out how to do that or to fail, right? So that's what we mean by intent-centric, that users describe what they want, which could be something as simple as sending a transfer, right? That's a very straightforward instruction. But it could also be something like finding someone to trade with, which brings me to the next part of counterparty discovery and settlement. So most blockchains right now deal with settlement. Settlement is what happens when you have a transaction, when you know what you want to do, and you just need to settle it. You know who you're interacting with, you know what you're trading, you know what's going to happen. Basically, you need it to be ordered by a blockchain so you can confirm it in history, update your sort of consensus state, right? Settlement is generally the second part of a process. And the first part of the process is counterparty discovery. So for anything more complex than a transfer, where you already know who the counterparty is by some other process, like going to the coffee store, you want to usually find a counterparty. So when you want to barter, when you want to do some sort of exchange between different currencies, when you want to do some kind of economic interaction involving heterogeneous units in multiple parties, you need to discover counterparties. And at the moment in the blockchain ecosystem, this happens in a kind of ad hoc way. There are, for example, OpenSea, some other 0x protocols like this run a server to store orders, which are signed messages. So they do counterparty discovery through just a server. It's not, centralizing this is not necessarily as bad as centralizing settlement. The server can't steal your assets, but it still has usually full view into all of your data, so it's not very privacy preserving. And the server can front run you because it has some control over ordering and censorship abilities. And there are other, Uniswap does counterparty discovery on chain in a weird way. There are, I think, some Cosmos blockchains, which maybe DYDX, which seem like they're going to do it by sending things around in the mempool. Anoma just builds a general layer for doing this. So it's like a kind of gossip network like the mempool, but the difference in a mempool, like the Tendermint mempool, you gossip around transactions which all validators need to eventually receive. And all of them need to be included in history, right? So it's a very simple gossip network because the nodes are homogeneous and you want all of them to receive all of the messages. Whereas in intent gossip, most of the time you're gossiping intents which might not necessarily be matched because maybe you don't have a counterparty. And it's important that trying to discover whether or not you have a counterparty is very cheap. So for that reason, the intent gossip network is sparse, as in you send around your, I want A, I have B. You basically turn that into a signed message, send it around, see if anyone has B and wants A. We can do ring trades, more complex things, but that's the basic pattern. And then once some kind of, if in fact there's a A for B, a B for C, and a C for A, someone, solver, can combine those three together, turn it into a transaction, and send it to the regular blockchain. So the first phase of that, the gossip and finding matches, that's what the solver does, that's counterparty discovery. Then the second phase is settlement.
That's quite a few things that you said there. Definitely need a new tagline. Just saying. Just saying. But I like that because those taglines, and the reason I like to ask about them was definitely not to tell you you need a new tagline. I'm really bad with those things, but it really helps to understand what the people behind the project try to put into that when you explain it like that. And I'm going to go from here to Anoma and economics, and you already started to talk about it, so I'm going to go back to that slowly. But I think even before that, I have a note here from when you were speaking, user-centric, and this is something I wanted to ask you about as well. It seems to me that a lot of the things you talk about and a lot of the things Anoma puts out there, I must say, I'm not that familiar with Anoma, but from what I know, from what I've read, from what I've seen, it's a lot about decentralization, a lot about some of the values that blockchains originated. Let's use that, right? If we were to talk about user centricism, can I say that like that? And about what is going on with governance and blockchains. And I want to know your opinion. We can take it to Cosmos. I don't know if you want to shoot at anybody feel free.
Go.
So in my opinion, I think that the way the blockchain governance is designed today, especially in proof of stake systems, and especially, well, not especially, but in proof of stake systems, and particularly in Cosmos, is definitely not user-centric. So I want you to comment on that and tell me what you think, and tell me how can we solve this in your opinion, or if it needs to be solved.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I would certainly agree. I would go further than that and say the way governance is currently designed in most proof of stake blockchain systems is random and not based on any coherent theory of much whatsoever. Well, there are a few factors here, and some of them are not bad. So one factor is, I think, a sort of misinterpreted good intention of more democracy. Everyone likes democracy, right? Democracy is the one word which is still universally good. Every country in the world is like People's Democratic Republic of the United States of a lot of prisons, whatever. But that's the one word. It's surprising. It is surprising to me because almost everything has been politically polarized now in the linguistic sphere, but democracy is still universally good. Everyone wants democracy. No one knows what the fuck democracy is. So in particular, a lot of blockchain systems designers have taken it upon themselves to implement democracy. Maybe there's some initial thing of we need to coordinate hard forks, which is true, but and they've made voting systems. And the most direct thing you could do is to make voting systems where everyone can vote, and maybe you have one layer of delegation to balloters or something like this. The problem is that this solves the easy part of the problem, which solves the part that doesn't matter very much. What makes democratic society? I think there's a good historical record on this. If you read De Tocqueville, Democracy in America, something like this, what makes democratic societies work is not the voting mechanisms. What makes democratic societies work is the systems of consensus building, I would say, where people discuss, where there are many different layers of groups which come to sort of independent consensuses and then negotiate with each other. And in particular, democracies also work as a check on the elites when they provide a credible threat that if you do such and such, you will be voted out of office. And when they change the incentives for elections in ways that at least kind of, democracies are not particularly good at selecting for extremely good leaders, but they're sometimes okay at selecting against really awful leaders. And that, maybe it's the most we can expect out of a system of government. Luckily, blockchains aren't solving a problem that is that hard. They're solving a much more constrained problem because they're not governments. They don't control armies yet. Please don't make them control armies. So we don't need to go that far. But, to me, the key question another exacerbating factor, just to, go through the analysis here, as I think it's interesting, is that often someone launches a blockchain project and then they do some things and then they don't know what to do after that. And so they say, oh, governance can figure out what to do. This doesn't work. It's never going to work. It's like creating a board to solve a problem, which already doesn't work, except that you're creating a giant board composed of random people who can all exit at any time to solve the problem, which is even less likely to work. And it's not necessarily, from the perspective of an individual blockchain, wanting governance or forks or something makes sense. But from the perspective of an ecosystem of blockchains, I think that we can have a much higher risk tolerance. I think that we can tolerate structures which have, frankly, smaller numbers of parties making decisions, as long as it's easy to exit the system. Because, if you can move your money, maybe move your assets out of a system freely, then different systems can experiment with different things. They're more, in some sense, many blockchains, as it stands, are more like companies, which are de facto dictatorships, than they are like states. Insofar as blockchains have that structure, then I think we should be optimizing governance more for a lot of quick experiments than for conservatism. And large numbers of stakeholders voting to approve things is going to lead to conservative. Not American conservative, but classically conservative in the sense that risky changes are not, generally don't go through, more conservative governance. I think then there's a separate question of what do you actually need to design a governance system, and how do you think about the various actors involved, and what's the information flow, who's kind of, what is the purpose of the system in the first. You can't design governance absent of a purpose. States are maybe a slight exception to this, but they are exception grounded in different historically contingent reasons, and they don't apply to blockchains. So I think it's unlikely to, if you don't have a clear product definition for your blockchain, unless you have a community with some other bonds, if you have a localized community, I think this is different. If you have a community in some economic, who has some other reason than the blockchain for coordinating with each other, then maybe a governance system makes sense. then the governance system could be used by that community to like agree on what they want the blockchain to do for their community. But if the blockchain is the community and the governance system is supposed to decide what the blockchain, i.e. the community, is for, then there's no purpose to the system anymore, and it will eventually probably fall apart.
Will we ever come to a day where blockchain governance going to become efficient, in your opinion? On-chain governance.
Right. To me, the central question is always, what is governance supposed to be doing? So you could have a very narrow definition of governance, which is like...
Be efficient.
Right. Efficient at what, right? Efficient is always towards some kind of purpose.
Anything.
All right.
I'm being devil's advocate, of course. I have to be a little bit, so I have to like...
Yeah, fair.
Yeah.
To use some examples. So I'm not the most plugged into the Cosmos governance ecosystem, but as I understand, in Cosmos, people have used governance proposals to agree on some hard forks, to discuss potential protocol changes and roadmaps, and to sometimes distribute funds. Usually it's some kind of form of public goods funding or funding open source work, funding communications work, stuff like that. I actually think these are very different problems. So, and they probably should be treated by different systems. So the problem of funding public goods or funding work that's relevant to a community or a project is very interesting and important. I think it is considerably easier than whole different space and mechanisms than most current Cosmos governance systems, because you don't need total consensus. So you need total consensus for something like a hard fork, because if two different, 50% agrees on one hard fork, 50% agrees on the other hard fork, the system will fork. So if you want governance to kind of act before hard forks, then you need total consensus. But just for spending funds, you can mint more funds, right? Or as long as they fall under some cap, maybe the decisions themselves are not necessarily conflicting with each other. So I think you can build governance systems which are much more oriented around like sufficient quorums to do things, but which don't go through everybody. And for public goods funding in particular, there are interesting design directions. And quadratic public goods funding, you could do some kind of liquid democracy. There are kind of many different options that don't look like proposal voting. I think retroactive public goods funding is a really interesting candidate. I hope some people try that. I think like a lot of mechanism experimentation would be a good way to go. For specifically coordinating on hard forks in general, where the hard forks are like extremely technical, like they're fixing a bug or they're like fixing or optimizing some existing feature, I think the proposal process works fine. It could be optimized somewhat, but those don't seem to be controversial. Validators, the tooling could be better, but like the kind of structure is okay. When the hard forks are sort of changing major things, or there's like some strategic question, then it's not that relevant. Like what's relevant is the process in the community beforehand to come to consensus. And what the actual voting mechanism is kind of subsidiary to that. I think that sometimes, for example, with the Cosmos Hub and Atom 2, there were a lot of different camps with kind of long-standing different ideas about what the Cosmos Hub should do. And I honestly, to me, the important question is, can we come up with some like more economically reasonable way of forking so that those camps can experiment independently instead of being so tied together? I think being tied together is what's inefficient. It would be much better if we could just like, suppose the Cosmos Hub has some like value, right? Like in part, what enables people to collaborate on it is that, they can exchange atoms for other currencies, or like there's some people who want to use the system. I think it would be nice if we could come up with a sort of different way of forking that was not just like creating two tokens, or maybe different ways to coordinate integrations so that forking becomes more palatable, so that the different camps who want different incompatible protocol changes could just split. I think there's not necessarily been a lot of mechanism work on this so far. I mean, it's tricky because a lot of value is like name recognition or something like this. Like it's how exactly can you automate this from a protocol perspective? I'm not sure. But you could do some like exchange rate agreements or something like this. There are options. So I think that would be interesting. I think the final part of governance system design that I'll cover that I think is relevant is privacy. Privacy is very important because it allows people to make decisions in a way that is resistant against cherry picking. So let me explain what I mean by this. I would say privacy is like a tool in the governance resilience design toolkit. So privacy doesn't really change like what your governance system should do, and it doesn't change the voting mechanism, but it can provide resilience. And what a lot of blockchain governance systems lack is resilience, as in it's very effective for outsiders to attack the system, not by sort of proposing constructive alternatives, but by kind of sometimes bike shedding, like saying that it should be $19 instead of $20, and sometimes, attacking specific parties based on how they vote or stuff like this. Think about like the theory of voting systems. Usually what you want to do is elicit true information from participants, as in elicit their honest preference about which alternative would be better. And if votes are not private, then if participants know that their votes will be seen and they vote due to some other reason, then you're actually not eliciting that information anymore. You're eliciting like the other system information. Or in more direct terms, if, everyone can be bribed to vote, then when you conduct a vote tally, you're not learning what people think about this proposal. You're just learning who had the most money, which is fine. Maybe you're fine with learning that, but you've ended up with a different system, right? So I think privacy is a very useful tool for designing more resilient governance systems, especially because of how configurable zero-knowledge proofs are. You can really whatever balance you want to strike of, okay, maybe the votes are private, but the output is public, or some kind of aggregate totals are public. Wherever you kind of want to draw the line between individual actions are private, some collective outputs are public, or some statistics are public, you could do that, at least eventually, with these kinds of very configurable privacy technologies, such as ZKPs and some homomorphic encryption, maybe. I think there's a lot of room there for experimentation.
Homomorphic encryption is the holy grail, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we don't go into that because I know it's a topic you're interested in, but definitely for another time because it's a huge, huge topic. I just want to ask you one more thing about governance. Do you think it's fair that, especially without tools like privacy, that centralized, biased, and self-interested entities are allowed to publicly vote on important things? I'm talking about validators, of course, and I'm a validator, by the way, and we validate Cosmos Hub, of course. We are a self-interested, centralized, biased entity that I don't think should be able to publicly vote.
Interesting. I guess I think it's a matter of degree. Everyone's a centralized, biased entity. That's what makes them people or organizations, and that's what gives them preferences. And if there weren't such things, then there would be no point designing any blockchain systems in the first place. So to some extent, it's always a matter of degree.
I like it.
I think there's an interesting question as to what degree it makes sense to align validator voting power with governance power. And at the moment, the Cosmos ecosystem answer is very high alignment. Delegators can override, but validators have the default vote, and there's not a separate delegate in general. I think maybe that's too high, and you can make it somewhat less, give people the ability to delegate to different folks. But on the other hand, validators do have some incentive alignment with the network as a whole. Often they hold the token, have some stake bonds, and I think you could end up with a system that's if you end up with a system where those two groups are not coordinated at all, or not correlated at all, then you might have different problems. Then maybe governance votes to do something, but validators don't want to do it. And the validators are the ones who run the codes. They always kind of have the final say. So I think it's a complex question, actually. I think there is more room. I'd be curious to see, in a system where the choice is more free, where you can delegate your vote to a validator, or you can also delegate your vote to someone else who's not a validator, but just a delegate. I would be curious to see what equilibria look like.
I think I've seen some experiments on ETH projects, but I'm not sure, so I'm not going to go into it. By the way, just for the record, not everybody likes the word democracy. In my opinion, that word associates with really red bells, and
okay.
I think it's a really, really bad thing. Tendermint to me sounds like a much better consensus than the word democracy. So, and it's not perfect for sure, like we just been speaking about. So, but Chris, I know I'm really fascinated because I really want to get more into your head, but I know that I want to keep it still up to the hour, and so I'm gonna go to the blitz. I'm sorry.
Okay.
3 questions. Feel free to answer a bit more, not as fast as you can. Feel free to answer how you want. And one of them you already kind of been answering because you already been mentioning a lot of projects that you're really interested in. But this is the first question. Give me a couple, 3 projects that you're really interested in terms of R&D and research and development. What are they working on? What are they doing? Maybe in consensus, maybe in ZK proofs, something like that. So a few projects, if you can, please.
Sure. I would say, I think the Circles project is doing some really interesting work in kind of economics, product design. They're trying to work on a private web of trust now, based in Berlin. I'd say I'm always inspired by Henry de Valence and Penumbra's kind of tight engineering designs that are very purpose-driven and very sort of elegant to accomplish their specific product of a private interchain DEX. So looking forward to see what happens there. I've read some really good consensus papers, mostly focused on DAGs. Unfortunately, they all seem to be being implemented by ex-Facebook teams who have brilliant consensus researchers and god-awful products. Sorry.
I like
But,
this. I like this.
yeah. I think the brilliant consensus researchers should work on a product which deserves them instead of like DeFi clones. It doesn't deserve their consensus research.
What about something like one project in terms of privacy? What have you seen? Anything that makes you aroused in terms of research in privacy or research of, maybe eliminating or lowering the cost for ZK proofs or something like that? I don't know, whatever something interests you
Right.
in privacy.
There's some people working on hardware acceleration for ZKPs, which is great. I think, I kind of just expect ZKP proof cost to come down. I think there's enough ecosystem momentum that we can rely on that for several years. Hardware acceleration will give another few orders of magnitude. There's some still, there's kind of a convergence of Plonk and Halo 2, still some software improvements. I think private architectures actually seem to be converging to me, like Alio, Anoma, at least very sexy, although I don't know exactly what Espresso Systems is doing. At least the sort of private components of that architecture have ended up looking very similar. I think it's pretty constrained by using ZKPs. So maybe there's actually some more opportunity for shared code there. The application stacks of these protocols look different. They have different features, but some of the core like privacy technology is similar. Any specific?
It's good.
I would say people working on FHE, which I do not personally. I'm still a neophyte to that area of cryptography, so I don't know enough to understand how feasible all the research actually is. But I think there's Sunscreen, there's Zama, there's even if it's early, if there's money going towards making that cryptography faster and more practical, then I'm excited to see what happens.
Cool. Second question, man. And this is going to be an unusual one. Give me 2 things which motivate you in your daily life to build on. Well, I guess if I was to summarize what you say, to build a better financial system, right? But give me 2 motivational things that you do in your daily life that, if you want to share them, of course, that keep on helping you doing this.
Yeah, I would say, I guess I try to read, especially perspectives of people who are reflecting on this question, but are not in the blockchain sphere. There's always, you want the right amount of cultiness, right? You want to be a little bit culty so you can develop interesting ideas without just ending up at mainstream consensus, but you want to be not too culty that you go completely off the deep end. So I'm not sure if I maintain that balance or not, but at least I'm trying. I've been reading a book called The End of Finance. I can highly recommend it. Very good book.
Perfect.
Best so far from my understanding of what on earth is the current financial system and why, or at least how, even if there's no why. It's that in terms of inspiration. Yeah, also just talking to people, people who are, both in and outside the ecosystem and trying to understand, what they want, how their perspective on things. Especially, it's always encouraging when you I would say you learn that you've been thinking about the same problem, but you didn't know it. That moment is always very, very inspiring.
It's always a boom when you've been like, oh, damn, I've been thinking about this for 10 years. You kind of already just said that answer to the last question, but I'm still going to ask it because you might say something completely different to what I'm hearing. Give me, dead or alive, one inspirational person to follow. I know it's very hard to follow dead people, but it could be a book, it could be an author, it could be a GitHub account, it could be a Medium account, anything you want.
Yeah, I would say probably Moxie Marlinspike from Signal, because I think Signal has struck the very hard practical balance of building a protocol which is sort of cryptographically secure and correct, and building a product that exposes the features of that protocol in a way which, on balance, makes most users safer. It's not perfect, but it's close, and it's very hard to strike that balance. Blockchains have failed so far. They have not yet done it so far. Anything like the reach or kind of effectiveness that Signal has. So I would say, slightly scoped in this area, but I find Moxie's work very inspiring.
Thanks. Chris, it's been fascinating. The least I can say. Unfortunately, I don't know, this always happens. When you have somebody you want to talk to, it's just beep, beep, that's it. Man, though, thank you very, very much for finding the time to join us today. And thank you for sharing all your views, man. It was fascinating to listen to them.
Sure thing. Thanks for the great questions. Good luck with Citizen Cosmos.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody. Bye. This content was created by the Citizen Cosmos Validator. If you enjoyed it, please support us by delegating to Citizen Cosmos and help us to create more educational content.